Have you ever stopped to think that the biggest barrier between you and success as an entrepreneur might be something you're trying to avoid at all costs? Yes, I'm talking about vulnerability. In fact, many of us were taught that showing any sign of weakness could be detrimental, especially in the business world. But what if I told you that vulnerability is actually one of your greatest sources of strength? That might sound contradictory, I know. After all, in the entrepreneurial world, the image of someone unshakable, who has everything under control, is often the most valued. But the truth is, the more we try to be perfect, the further we move away from our most genuine and powerful potential. Vulnerability, at its core, is the courage to be seen as we really are, with our uncertainties, fears, and, of course, our dreams. It connects us with people, creates more authentic relationships, and, most importantly, opens space for innovation and creativity. If you've ever felt tired of trying to look strong all the time, or wondered how being authentic could impact your business, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to talk about 5 ways vulnerability can actually make you a stronger entrepreneur. And believe me, you're not alone in this. We've all faced that same internal struggle at some point. Let's explore this together, openly and with sincerity. Because, in the end, that's where true strength lies, in the courage to allow yourself to be seen, to connect deeply, and to understand that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the source of all growth. Vulnerability opens space for creativity and innovation. Let's start with a truth that might be uncomfortable for many entrepreneurs. Innovation is born from risk, and risk, by definition, is uncertain. Vulnerability, the willingness to expose yourself to emotional risk, uncertainty, and being open, is what allows us to tap into our true creative potential. It's this openness to the unknown that drives innovation. Now, think about your journey as an entrepreneur. How many times have you felt like you had to have all the answers? That being seen as vulnerable, as someone still learning or making mistakes, would be a fatal blow to your professional image? I get it, because we've all been there. However, it's precisely this fear of being seen as imperfect that blocks your greatest asset as an entrepreneur, your ability to innovate. One of the things I talk about most regarding vulnerability is that it's not weakness, it's courage. When we open ourselves to the new, when we let go of the fear of criticism and failure, something extraordinary happens. That's when creativity can truly flourish. Brené Brown speaks a lot about how vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, and this is even more evident in entrepreneurship. One of the key concepts Brown strongly advocates is the idea of psychological safety, the kind of environment where people feel safe to express themselves without fear of judgment or punishment. And this is essential for innovation. If you're leading a team, ask yourself, do my team members feel they can take risks and fail without fear? Because without that sense of safety, people will cling to what's familiar, what they already know. And innovation never comes from the predictable. For example, if a team member has an innovative idea but fears that if it fails, they'll be ridiculed or seen as incompetent, do you think they'll take the risk? It's unlikely. And if this happens often, you create an environment where the fear of failure stifles creativity. So, when we talk about vulnerability in the context of leadership, we're not just talking about you as an individual, but how you can create a space where your team feels comfortable being vulnerable as well. Here, vulnerability is directly tied to innovation. The big ideas, the ones that truly change the game, come from the willingness to try something new, to explore unknown territories. And yes, this comes with the risk of failure. But the point isn't to avoid failure, it's to use vulnerability to embrace uncertainty and, from there, discover new possibilities. Want a practical example? Think of the biggest innovations we've seen, companies like Apple, Tesla, and even giants in technology like Microsoft. Steve Jobs was a master of creative vulnerability. When he launched the first iPhone, the risk was enormous. What if it didn't work out? What if people didn't like it? But it was precisely the act of exposing himself to that risk that forever transformed the smartphone market. Jobs didn't have absolute certainty that his product would be a success. He was vulnerable, at the mercy of criticism and the possibility of failure. But it was this vulnerability that allowed innovation to happen. Brené Brown emphasizes that creativity is inseparable from vulnerability. You can't create something new without being willing to fail. And this is an essential truth for any entrepreneur who wants to leave a mark on the world. Another example is Elon Musk. Many of Musk's visionary ideas, like the affordable electric car, commercial space travel, and even the creation of an underground transportation network, were initially seen as impossible or, at the very least, too risky. However, Musk launched these projects with an incredible willingness to fail, learn, and try again. This courage to expose himself to ridicule and criticism, to be vulnerable enough to admit that success wasn't guaranteed, is what allows innovation to happen on such a massive scale. Be honest. How many times have you avoided trying something new because you were afraid of being criticized? Or of looking incompetent? This is one of the biggest blocks any entrepreneur can face. The fear of criticism can be paralyzing. Brené Brown highlights this very clearly in her studies on shame and vulnerability. She explains that many of us prefer to stay safe, in our comfort zones, because it protects us from being exposed to the judgment of others. But true innovation happens outside of that safe zone. In entrepreneurship, this is particularly evident. If you're trying to create something innovative, different, revolutionary, you're going to expose yourself. There's no way around it. And there will be criticism, there will be moments when you feel insecure and even doubt yourself. But it's precisely in these situations that vulnerability turns into strength. Instead of paralyzing you, it pushes you forward, reminding you that you're brave enough to keep going, even without the guarantee of success. Now, the big question: how do you apply this in practice? How do you make vulnerability an ally in your creative process? Here are some practices you can adopt, based on Brené Brown's teachings. Embrace discomfort. Vulnerability will never be comfortable. There will always be that nervous feeling when you expose yourself to risk. But you have to accept that discomfort is part of the process. Instead of avoiding it, embrace it. It's in that space of uncertainty that the magic of creativity happens. Rethink your relationship with failure. Failure isn't the end of the world. In fact, as Brown always emphasizes, mistakes are a fundamental part of learning. Each failure brings you closer to a solution, teaching you something new. So, start seeing failure not as something to be avoided, but as an opportunity for growth. Share your insecurities. Talking about your fears and doubts can be liberating. Instead of trying to hide your vulnerabilities, share them with trusted people. This creates an environment of empathy and can even open doors to new ideas and solutions you hadn't considered. Encourage vulnerability in your team. As a leader, you have the opportunity to create a culture of vulnerability. Encourage your team to take risks, to share their ideas, no matter how out of the box they may seem. When people feel safe being vulnerable, they create more freely and authentically. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this content and it's bringing new perspectives to your entrepreneurial journey, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This helps us know we're on the right track, and of course, it ensures you'll be the first to know when new videos are released. Let's walk this growth journey together. 2. Vulnerability strengthens your connections with others. Imagine this. You're sitting in a business meeting, and someone from your team presents an innovative idea they're developing. Suddenly, their voice falters, they start to tremble, and admit they're unsure if it will work. What do you feel in that moment? The answer is empathy. And that's exactly what vulnerability does. It connects us in powerful ways. Brené Brown talks a lot about how vulnerability is the key to forming genuine connections. When you allow yourself to be seen with all your imperfections and uncertainties, you create a space where others feel comfortable being authentic as well. In entrepreneurship, this is essential. True connections don't happen through a facade of perfection, but when people see themselves reflected in each other, in both struggles and successes. Every human has a basic need for belonging, for feeling part of something bigger. In the business world, this need doesn't disappear, it actually intensifies. Whether you're a solo entrepreneur or leading a team, vulnerability is what allows those around you to feel they belong to an environment where their voices are heard, their ideas are valued, and their failures are seen as part of the process. Brené Brown talks about how the fear of disconnection drives us away from our authenticity. Often, at work, we create masks of perfection out of fear of not being accepted or respected. Ironically, though, these masks create barriers instead of building bridges. If you want to build a cohesive team and a strong network, authenticity is what will set you apart. When you allow yourself to be vulnerable, you open the door for others to do the same, strengthening the sense of belonging. When we talk about leadership, especially in entrepreneurship, many associate it with the idea of unshakable strength, total control, and a near impenetrable stance against failure or uncertainty. But Brené Brown, in her studies on vulnerability, reminds us that true leadership is much more about human connection than authority. Let's think about it. What kind of leader inspires more trust and loyalty? The one who never admits mistakes and always seems distant, or the leader who shares their struggles, who admits when they don't know something, and invites their team to find solutions together? The answer is clear. Vulnerable leadership doesn't diminish a leader's authority, on the contrary, it strengthens it. This is because vulnerability builds a foundation of genuine trust, which is the true glue of great teams. Brené often says that trust is built in small moments of vulnerability. So, when you, as a leader, admit you don't have all the answers, you're not only practicing vulnerability but also showing your team that it's okay not to be perfect. This creates a healthier, more collaborative, and undoubtedly more productive work environment. Now, let's go beyond teams. When we think of entrepreneurs, many assume vulnerability should be something confined to internal environments, between you and your employees. However, vulnerability can be an extremely powerful tool in building relationships with clients as well. How many times have you seen a brand or company admit a mistake publicly? In the digital world, where everything is so visible, many companies desperately try to hide their mistakes for fear of damaging their reputation. However, companies that own their failures, apologize, and, more importantly, show a clear plan to fix the problem, are the ones that gain the most respect and trust. Vulnerability here translates into transparency. When you're honest with your customers, whether it's about a mistake in the process or a challenge you're facing, you open the door to a deeper connection. People trust those who are authentic. As Brené Brown explains, people are tired of perfection, what they want is the truth. And this couldn't be more true in the relationship between businesses and customers. A classic example of this happened with Zappos. When they made a pricing error that resulted in a massive financial loss, they didn't try to hide or quietly correct it. On the contrary, they apologized, honored the prices they advertised, and were completely transparent. The result? The respect of their customers increased. This example reinforces the idea that vulnerability, when well managed, strengthens trust. Now, if you're thinking, okay, I get that vulnerability is important for leadership and building connections, but how do I apply this in the day-to-day of my business? Let's dive into some practical points. Fostering open communication. Encourage your team to talk openly about their challenges, not just their victories. As a leader, be the first to share your own difficulties and what you're doing to overcome them. This creates a trust-filled space where everyone feels comfortable contributing without fear of judgment. Celebrating mistakes as learning opportunities. Change the mindset around mistakes. Instead of treating them as a problem, view them as growth opportunities. Show that you value the attempt, even if it didn't work out, and encourage your team to do the same. A culture that doesn't punish failure but instead discourages not trying is a culture that thrives. Practicing empathy in daily interactions. Empathy is one of the fundamental pillars of vulnerability. By practicing empathy, whether with your team or with customers, you establish a deeper connection. This can be done through small gestures, like listening attentively, acknowledging others' emotions, and offering support when needed. Incorporating authenticity into your brand. Don't be afraid to show the human side of your business. People are increasingly drawn to brands that demonstrate transparency and authenticity. This can be done through campaigns that share behind-the-scenes moments, real stories of overcoming challenges, or even moments of vulnerability that highlight the human side of your company. By embracing vulnerability, you'll find that it not only strengthens your leadership but also deepens your connections with your team and customers, fostering a more authentic and collaborative business environment. If there's one thing we've learned from Brené Brown, it's that trust and vulnerability are deeply intertwined. In the business world, trust is the most valuable asset you can cultivate, whether with your employees, partners, or customers. And that trust is born in the moments when you allow yourself to be vulnerable. Think of a bridge. The strongest structure isn't built with bricks of perfection, but with honesty, openness, and the willingness to be authentic. Every time you allow yourself to reveal a little more of who you truly are, you're placing another brick in that bridge, one that connects you to those around you in a much stronger and more genuine way. 3. Vulnerability turns failures into lessons. Failure. It's a word few of us like to hear. In the world of entrepreneurship, failure is often seen as something to avoid at all costs, a blemish on the image of success. But what if I told you that failure could be the key to your greatest growth? That, through vulnerability, it can transform from an insurmountable obstacle into one of your best learning opportunities? This is one of the core lessons from Brené Brown's research. She talks about how the fear of failure is closely tied to our vulnerability, and that the real problem isn't failure itself, but how we handle it. When we resist vulnerability, when we try to hide or ignore our mistakes, we miss the chance to learn from them. However, when we're brave enough to be vulnerable, to acknowledge our errors and extract valuable lessons from them, failure becomes a powerful tool for growth. Let's be honest, most of us grew up believing that failure was something shameful, something to be hidden. In entrepreneurship, this fear is amplified. Society promotes a culture where success is glamorized, and failure is something we'd rather not talk about. Entrepreneurs are always showcasing their success stories, but rarely do they discuss the times they failed. The reality, however, is that failure is part of every entrepreneur's journey, and more importantly, it's an essential part of that journey. Brené Brown, in her studies on shame and resilience, reminds us that shame is directly tied to the fear of failure. When we make mistakes, the immediate feeling is one of personal failure, as if the error is a reflection of who we are. But the truth is that failure doesn't define us, it informs us. It's through failure that we find opportunities to reinvent ourselves and improve our ideas and strategies. Let's look at some of the biggest names in business. Take Sarah Blakely, founder of Spanx, a billion-dollar shapewear company. What many don't know is that, as a child, Blakely's father encouraged his kids to fail. Every day he would ask, "What did you fail at today?" For him, failure wasn't something to fear, but a fundamental part of learning. This lesson shaped Blakely, who came to see failure as an opportunity to try new things without the fear of judgment. It allowed her to become one of the most innovative and successful entrepreneurs of her generation. Another notable example is Thomas Edison. When he was developing the incandescent light bulb, he failed around 1,000 times before finding the right formula. When asked how he felt about failing so many times, Edison replied, "I didn't fail. I just found 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb." Edison demonstrated the essence of vulnerability, the willingness to keep trying, even when results don't come immediately. Brené Brown is clear in saying that vulnerability and resilience go hand in hand. Being resilient doesn't mean being immune to failure. Quite the opposite. True resilience comes from accepting that failure is part of the process and that, through it, we become stronger. This applies not only to our technical skills but also to our emotional development as entrepreneurs. In entrepreneurship, vulnerability allows us to say, "Yes, I failed. And this is teaching me something valuable." This attitude not only opens the doors to learning but also helps build a growth mindset. By viewing failures as learning opportunities, you're training your brain to see mistakes not as barriers, but as chances to improve. Okay, you might be asking, but in practice, what can I learn from my failures? A lot. Brené Brown teaches us that failures are actually disguised teachers. They teach us what doesn't work, show us the areas where we need to improve, and, perhaps most importantly, connect us more deeply with our humanity. Here are some lessons that failure can teach us. Humility. Failure reminds us that we're human and that we don't have all the answers. It keeps us humble, open to learning from others, and willing to seek collaborative solutions. Creativity. Often, failure forces our creativity. When something doesn't go as planned, we're pushed to think of alternative solutions, explore new approaches, and experiment. Without failure, many of the world's greatest innovations would never have happened. Persistence. Failure teaches us persistence. It reminds us that success rarely happens the first time and that we need to keep trying, adjusting our approach, and learning from each attempt. Empathy. When we fail, we become more empathetic. We start to better understand others' struggles, which makes us more compassionate and understanding leaders. This, in turn, improves our interpersonal connections and our ability to lead teams more effectively. Now that we understand that vulnerability turns failure into learning, the question is, how can you apply this in your day-to-day as an entrepreneur? Here are some ways to put this perspective into practice in your business. Review your past failures. Look back and make a list of times when you believe you failed. What did those experiences teach you? Instead of focusing on the negative outcome, focus on the lessons you took from those moments. What would you do differently now? This exercise not only helps reframe failure but also prepares you better for future challenges. Create a culture that values learning from mistakes. If you lead a team, encourage your employees to openly share their failures. When someone makes a mistake, ask questions like, "What did we learn from this?" or "How can we adjust our approach from here?" By creating this space, you're showing that failure isn't the end but a starting point for improvement. Practice regular self-reflection. Set aside time to reflect on your mistakes and successes. Brené Brown emphasizes the importance of having a self-reflection practice that allows us to understand how we're handling our challenges and what we can learn from them. This practice keeps vulnerability present in your daily life, allowing continuous learning. Share your failure stories. One of the most powerful ways to cultivate vulnerability is to share your own failure stories. When you openly talk about your mistakes, you give others permission to do the same. This creates a more honest and collaborative environment where everyone can grow together. By embracing failure as part of your entrepreneurial journey, you open yourself up to deeper learning, creativity, and growth. And through vulnerability, you'll find that failure isn't something to fear, but a vital step toward long-term success. 4. Vulnerability builds a more human leadership. When we think of leadership, especially in the context of entrepreneurship, the most common image that comes to mind is someone strong, unshakable, who always has all the answers. This notion that a leader must be infallible is incredibly widespread. But if there's one thing I've learned from studying vulnerability, it's that the leaders who make the biggest difference aren't those who never make mistakes, but those who are courageous enough to admit they are human too. Brené Brown, in her research, emphasizes the importance of leading with empathy, authenticity, and above all, vulnerability. At the heart of effective leadership is connection, and connection can only exist where there's honesty and openness. Being vulnerable as a leader isn't a sign of weakness, as many believe. In fact, it's one of the most powerful ways to build trust and engagement within a team. We've grown up believing that great leaders are those who never falter, always know what to do, and are immune to failure. However, this concept is a major obstacle to truly effective leadership. The truth is, no one has all the answers all the time. And when a leader tries to maintain this posture of invulnerability, they distance themselves from their team and the people around them. This disconnection weakens trust, and when trust diminishes, teamwork suffers. Brené Brown explains that the armor many leaders wear to appear strong actually creates a barrier that prevents authentic connections from forming. Instead of inspiring trust, this behavior breeds distrust because people inherently know that no one is perfect. When a leader pretends to be invulnerable, they send a clear message to their team: "I'm not available to be real with you." And that's devastating for morale and productivity. So how does vulnerability transform leadership? First, it humanizes the leader. When you, as an entrepreneur or manager, admit that you don't have all the answers, you create space for your team to feel more comfortable collaborating. Brené Brown talks about how vulnerability creates an environment where people feel safe to be themselves, and that includes making mistakes and learning together. If you're wondering whether leading with vulnerability will compromise your authority, know that the opposite is true. Being vulnerable builds a different kind of respect, one based on trust and transparency. When team members see that you're willing to admit your own mistakes or ask for help when needed, they realize you value truth and growth more than an image of perfection. This attitude also opens the door for them to do the same. They'll know that if they make a mistake, you'll listen, support, and help them find a solution instead of judging them. This not only boosts team morale but also promotes a culture of innovation, where people feel encouraged to bring new and creative ideas to the table without fear of repercussions. One of the most powerful messages Brené Brown shares in her studies is that trust is built in small moments of vulnerability. Trust between a leader and their team isn't built through grand gestures, but in everyday moments where you choose to be authentic instead of perfect. For example, imagine your team is facing a difficult challenge. Instead of pretending you have all the solutions or that nothing affects you, you could be honest and say, "I'm finding this situation challenging too, but let's work together to find the best solution." This simple act of honesty opens the door to genuine collaboration. It shows your team that you trust them and that you're willing to be vulnerable enough to solve the problem together. Additionally, vulnerable leaders are also more open to receiving feedback. They create an environment where their employees feel comfortable pointing out areas for improvement because they know the leader won't react defensively, but with openness and gratitude. This is crucial for growth, both for the leader and the team. If we look at great leaders around the world, those who truly made a lasting impact, many of them share the courage to lead with vulnerability. A notable example is Howard Schultz, former CEO of Starbucks. When Schultz returned to Starbucks during a time of crisis, he didn't try to hide the company's difficulties. Instead, he was transparent with his employees about the challenges the company faced and asked for help in finding solutions. This act of vulnerability not only rebuilt the team's trust but also revitalized the company as a whole. Another example is Oprah Winfrey, who frequently talks about her own struggles and vulnerabilities. She has never hidden the challenges she faced throughout her life and career, which made her one of the most trusted and beloved public figures in the world. Her ability to open up and be vulnerable created such a deep connection with her audience that she became one of the most influential leaders of our time. Now, let's talk about how you can start practicing vulnerability in your daily leadership. Like any practice, this takes time and effort, but the results are worth it. Here are some ways to incorporate vulnerability into your leadership approach. Admit when you don't know something. One of the greatest gifts you can give your team is honesty. If you're facing a situation where you don't know the best decision, say it. "I don't know, but let's figure it out together," is a simple yet incredibly powerful phrase. It shows humility and a willingness to learn, which inspires your team to do the same. Share your experiences of failure. Don't be afraid to talk about your own mistakes or past difficulties. When you share your failure stories and what you learned from them, you create an environment where failure is seen as an opportunity to learn, not a permanent mark of incompetence. Practice active listening. Leading with vulnerability also means being willing to listen, truly listen, to your team's concerns and ideas. It's not just about listening to respond, but about listening to understand. When your team sees that you're genuinely interested in what they have to say, trust grows, and collaboration improves. Support your team in difficult times. When a team member makes a mistake or faces a challenge, be present to offer support. Instead of judging or punishing, offer help and guidance. This strengthens trust and shows that you're committed to their development, not just immediate results. Create spaces for honest dialogue. Set aside time to have open conversations with your team about how they're feeling, what's worrying them, and what they think could be improved. This can be done in one-on-one or group meetings. The key is to make these dialogues sincere and welcoming, without fear of judgment. When you start practicing vulnerability in your leadership, the results become clear. Your team feels more connected, trust increases, and the work environment becomes more collaborative and creative. People start to feel safe giving their best without the pressure of trying to be perfect all the time. This fosters a culture of innovation where everyone can contribute ideas and, most importantly, learn from mistakes. Leading with vulnerability doesn't mean you have to expose all your feelings all the time, but that you're willing to be real. And in today's world, where authenticity is increasingly valued, this is one of the greatest strengths a leader can have. 5. Vulnerability strengthens resilience. Resilience is a word we hear frequently, especially in business. But what does it truly mean to be resilient? Many associate resilience with brute strength, as if it's just about enduring adversity without showing any emotion. However, according to Brené Brown, true resilience is deeply connected to vulnerability. In reality, it's the willingness to be vulnerable, to admit that we're shaken, that we don't have all the answers, and that we need help, that builds the foundation for lasting resilience. Resilience isn't about never falling. It's about falling and having the courage to get back up, knowing that failure is part of the journey. And this requires vulnerability. It takes the willingness to be seen in our most difficult moments and still choose to move forward. When we try to block vulnerability, thinking we'll be stronger by ignoring our emotions or uncertainties, we actually become more fragile. Because resilience, in the end, is born from connection with others, from empathy, and from the ability to learn from our mistakes. All of which are only possible when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. There's a persistent myth in entrepreneurship that successful entrepreneurs are unbeatable, unshakable, and never show weakness. This myth creates an unrealistic expectation, one that often leads to burnout. After all, who can be strong all the time? The truth is, we all face challenges, difficult days, and moments of self-doubt. Brené Brown emphasizes that by denying our vulnerability, we distance ourselves from the very tools that can help us cope with adversity. Vulnerability connects us to our humanity and to others, allowing us to seek support, rethink strategies, and find new ways to face challenges. When you open up to your vulnerabilities, you become more capable of building the resilience needed to persevere through tough times. As an entrepreneur, this means recognizing that there will be failures, setbacks, and moments of doubt. These challenges don't define you, rather, it's how you choose to respond to them that matters. The willingness to ask for help, to accept that you can't do it all alone, and to learn from mistakes strengthens your ability to rise after every fall. Resilience and vulnerability are intrinsically connected because both involve accepting uncertainty. Being resilient doesn't mean guaranteeing that everything will always go right, but having the courage to keep going, even when there are no guarantees. And that is pure vulnerability. When we accept uncertainty, when we allow ourselves to be seen in our most fragile moments, we open the door to genuine resilience. Brené Brown highlights that emotional resilience comes from our ability to feel, connect with others, and understand that we're not alone in our challenges. Entrepreneurship can be a lonely journey, but only if you choose to isolate it. When you allow others to see your moments of vulnerability, whether it's your team, a mentor, or even other entrepreneurs, you're building a support network that strengthens your resilience. Remember, the greatest growth often happens in the midst of adversity. But to grow, you must admit that you don't have all the answers. You need to open yourself to learning and change. That's vulnerability, and it's what strengthens the ability to move forward, even after a failure or setback. Let's talk about what this looks like in practice. Imagine you're facing a crisis in your business. Sales are down, bills are piling up, and you feel like you're on the verge of losing everything you've built. The instinct in this moment might be to maintain appearances, to act as if everything is under control so as not to worry your team or partners. But this only adds more pressure and isolation. Now, consider a different approach. You acknowledge the situation, admit that you're struggling, and ask for support from your team. You open space for people to offer their ideas, get involved in solving problems, and share the emotional load you've been carrying alone. This willingness to be vulnerable makes your team feel more engaged, more connected to you, and more committed to the business's mission. This is the power of vulnerability in times of crisis. When you are transparent and human, the people around you feel more comfortable contributing. They understand that they are part of something real, and this strengthens not only you but also the entire company culture. There are many examples of entrepreneurs who demonstrated resilience through vulnerability. One famous case is Tony Hsieh, the late CEO of Zappos. During times of financial and operational difficulties, he was always transparent with his team about the challenges. Hsieh created a culture where people could openly talk about their struggles, and this transparency allowed everyone to come together and overcome obstacles. He believed that by creating a space of vulnerability and trust, the company became stronger, and this was one of the key factors that made Zappos a global success story. Another example is Richard Branson, founder of Virgin Group. Branson has always been known for his fearless attitude, but also for his willingness to admit when things weren't going well. He was never afraid to talk about his failures or the challenges he faced along the way. This not only helped him rise again and again, but also earned him the trust of his team and the public. One of the most important aspects of vulnerability in building resilience is knowing that you don't have to face everything alone. Brené Brown talks about how vulnerability connects us to others, and this connection is essential for building resilience. By opening up to others and allowing them to be part of your journey, you not only strengthen your own capabilities but also create an environment where everyone can grow together. Entrepreneurship can be a lonely journey, but vulnerability has the power to break that isolation. When you surround yourself with people you trust, with whom you can share your fears and challenges, you build a support network that helps you rise in times of crisis. This could be through mentors, business partners, or even your own team. Allowing yourself to ask for help is one of the greatest expressions of vulnerability, and also one of the most powerful. This doesn't diminish your ability as an entrepreneur. On the contrary, it shows that you're smart enough to know that no one can do everything alone. And this openness strengthens your resilience, allowing you to rise after every fall with more wisdom and strength. Vulnerability, at its core, is the willingness to move forward, even when we don't have all the guarantees. And it's this willingness that builds resilience. Because, in the end, what defines a successful entrepreneur isn't how many times they've fallen, but how many times they've had the courage to get back up and try again. And every time you allow yourself to be vulnerable, to admit that you're afraid, that you don't have all the answers, that you need support, you strengthen your ability to persevere. Resilience, then, isn't about being invulnerable. It's about being courageous enough to face adversity with honesty, openness, and the willingness to learn. Every challenge, every failure, every mistake is an opportunity for growth. And vulnerability is what allows us to turn those moments of difficulty into stepping stones for success. And finally, remember that vulnerability is a process, not a destination. No one becomes vulnerable overnight, and there's no point where you've made it. Throughout your journey as an entrepreneur, there will be moments of uncertainty, fear, and doubt. And that's okay. It's in this space that you'll find the greatest opportunities for growth. So, the question remains, are you ready to embrace vulnerability? Are you prepared to set aside the armor and allow yourself to be seen? Because by doing so, you'll not only become a stronger entrepreneur but also a more human, creative, and undoubtedly more successful leader. If this content resonated with you, or if it sparked thoughts you believe could help others, consider sharing. After all, we're all in this journey together, becoming more authentic, more courageous, and, why not, more vulnerable. Subscribe to the channel for more honest conversations like this, and let's keep exploring what truly makes us grow, as entrepreneurs and as human beings. Is the courage to embrace our imperfections, the willingness to learn from our failures, and the ability to connect with others through vulnerability. Growth comes not from avoiding mistakes or projecting an image of perfection, but from facing challenges head-on, being open to change, and allowing ourselves to be seen for who we really are. This authenticity fosters resilience, fuels creativity, and strengthens the relationships that drive us forward in both business and life.